There are times in the city when weary eyes seek respite from urban decay and glance upward, only to find the nest-laden, cracked concrete chimney pots of encroaching mansions limned in crimson, where a stray beam of sanguine light skewers low-hanging, lead-bellied clouds, the smog of perma-winter. And in that moment, the weary are filled not with hope, but with hollowness, for it seems they are not seeing a mere beam of light, but the dread glance of an indifferent deity inspecting its many minions. All that on a bus to work. Anyone prone to spiritual atrophy disease knows the urgency with which it needs to be expressed, like a drunken tongue or a rumbling gullet. Any scrap paper, smooth screen, or blank backhand will do for catchment. But which precedes what? Does existential dread squeeze poetry from a man, or does a poet squeeze existential dread from a man? The answer is both, but when true, it's the former. As a frequent sufferer of reality, I've always been strangely sensitive to the play of light in any space. Colour can be changed with mood. A pallid beam from an autumnal sun can at once bring exaltation or dread, depending on its hue, or its angle, or something. Such moments always feel like glimpses behind some sort of veil, and they always leave the mind molasses-like. So at 6, when I found a copy of Ian Livingstone's The Forest of Doom, and it told me to turn to a page beginning with a crow cawing on a tree outside, and at that exact moment a crow actually cawed on a tree outside, it blew my fucking molasses open. Much later I would come to know FromSoftware. It was autumn. I was young. I'd never heard of Demon Souls. I liked the generic dark fantasy look of this Dark Souls artwork, the no-nonsense ring to the name. Dark Souls. What does that even mean, I wondered. It means me. I am a Dark Souls. I bought it. The slumberous light of that morning fell in shafts across the beechwood floor of my childhood living room. The dread rarely reared its head in this sacred space, this bonfire of my youth, but it enjoys caffeine on hangovers, and I am an idiot. In short, Dark Souls Ian Livingstoned me. Most of the time, I have only a vague sense of what's happening in any Miyazaki world. It's a feat of human curiosity that people cobble together coherent myths from the myriad fragments scattered in-game, and I'd listen to it all day. But for me, that was the whole point. This game was bizarre, weird, strange, and yet somehow familiar. It felt like someone had found a way to transmogrify my inner landscape into a game. Ragged clouds and brooding skies, desolation pocked with beauty, broken myth, shifty strangers, solitude tinged with dread, weird relics, weirder enemies, untrustworthy friends, places of respite too few and far between, a lack of music except in select spaces. So the only score to your isolation is your own footfall, the shimmering inhalation of claimed souls. And what about Dark Souls, you ask? But I didn't write this to praise the game's aesthetics. What Ian Livingstoned me was the game's soul. Why should a game feel like home? After a decade of sitting with that question, I'll attempt an answer. Dark Souls, and FromSoftware games in general, are mythic in nature. But what does this actually mean? Myth is a framework for understanding the world, or a world, symbolic rather than logical. Forget coherence. to Caelid with logic. Linearity, causality, the idea of a beginning and an end. These are relics of the written age, born from ledgers and annals, not living tongues. That's how Zeus could be a rain cloud, or a bull, or a lad flinging thunderbolts. That's why the Morrigan was one entity and also three, depending on her mood that day. Oral tradition thrived on ambiguity. Only with writing did ambiguity move from the tale itself to its interpretation. Writing began as a way to track debt and transactions. The fluid world of memory hardened into clay. For the first time, thought had a body, and we began to think about thinking. So what's all this got to do with Dark Souls? Well, like I said, Dark Souls is mythic, and myth was our framework for engaging with the world for far longer than not. It engaged aspects of our nature that have since been reduced to, well, myth. And in our logical world, that very word has become synonymous with old wives' tales, superstitions, urban legends, to be debunked by those two old lads on that programme. Myth recognised no boundary between inner and outer worlds. That demarcation began with writing. But the age of reason turned it into a fortified wall. Gods were reduced to clashes of natural phenomena and archetypes of the psyche. Soul and spirit became illusions of selfhood, formed as byproducts of neural networks. And seers and prophets and augurs, well, they've got drugs for that now. For many years, symbolism was sequestered to the realm of art, but even that began to change. Art was taken as content, symbols as signs and brand logos. That disconnect was felt. And this is why, for me at least, Dark Souls felt like a return rather than an escape. A sort of psychic homecoming. It wasn't the first to do it either. Zelda, Shadow of the Colossus, Halo, Combat Evolved, and my personal favourite, Soul Reaver, all touched on the mythic, but it was the most profound. It came out just as Christopher Nolan's rendition of Batman was coming to an end. A realist and Freudian Bruce Wayne protecting a post-9/11 Chicago from an old nemesis. More jihad Joker this time than mythical trickster. For a good while there, Batman fans held those films as the gold standard. Ask now and you'll be shocked to hear Tim Burton in the mix again. But there's something else that made Dark Souls feel like home. That was, and forgive my internet here, its coziness. For the type of game it is, Dark Souls could have easily felt like a lonely hike across an empty blood gulch. But enter orbs, soapstones and bloodstains, an album I'd buy. These were Miyazaki's masterstroke. The man created the antithesis to social media. He found a way to make you feel alone together. I wouldn't have been able to articulate this peculiarity of Dark Souls had it not been for an elusive French philosopher I happened upon recently, Gaston Bachelard. His book, The Poetics of Space, is a strange yet endearing read that had me shouting, "That's literally Dark Souls," after every other page. It reads as philosophy, but that's just a formal framework for the poetic ramblings of a mind unfettered by disciplinary boundaries. To put it another way, Bachelard thinks mythically. The book explores the spaces we inhabit and how these spaces shape us as we shape them. Throughout, Bachelard uses the image of the house, be it an actual one or a metaphysical one, like a childhood home now out of reach. Both are spaces that shelter the daydreamer and allow one to dream in peace. A cosy place to imagine, in other words. And if all of this sounds like tripe to your keen and rational mind, then consider your own subconscious. We all have that one place that haunts us in dreams, a place that lives in us as much as we once lived in it, melt and meld like a timepiece in a Salvador Dali painting as it may. The verticality of a house, Bachelard says, represents the human psyche, the basement being the dark entity, a space of subterranean forces, the subconscious, the attic as the realm of clarity and rational thought. And he writes that when a creation is shared, it now becomes really our own. It takes root in us. It has been given us by another. But we begin to have the impression that we could have created it, that we should have created it. That's what I meant when I said Dark Souls felt like seeing my own inner landscape in a game. Even as I kept reading and shouting, "Dark Souls, that's literally Dark Souls," part of me thought I might be forcing the comparison. Until I got to the section where Bachelard describes a novel that made a deep impression on him. L'Antiquaire by Henry Bosco. In it, a hero descends into the basement of a house built into rock. Beneath a tower reaching for the sky, he wanders through a labyrinth of cellars and padlocked doors and comes upon a cosmic space, an immense body of murky water, stagnant and dense, charged with phosphorescence. Then he climbs a narrow, spiralling staircase to the tower and meets a young girl haunted by memories of an ardent ancestress. And on her missal he reads, "The flower is always in the almond." Dark Souls, that's literally Dark Souls. At this point I thought, it's probably not a shot in the dark to say Bachelard would have been a fan of FromSoft. Further on, he says of chests, "The complex pieces that a craftsman creates are very evident witnesses of the need for secrecy, of an intuitive sense of hiding places." Dark Souls, that's literally... He also devotes a chapter to nests. When we dream of a nest, we dream of a cosmic house. It is a nest for dreaming, a nest for the imagination, a nest for recollection. When we first escape the undead asylum and curl up in Snuggly the crow's nest to be spirited away to Lordran in a very Bachelardian fashion, we all understood on some deeper level what that moment represented. I hadn't the language for it until I read Bachelard, but I knew, at least, that there was something worth articulating. That's the language of symbolism in action. There's also a chapter on shells, and I thought, surely not. But then he writes, "The surest sign of wonder is exaggeration, and since the inhabitant of a shell can amaze us, the imagination will soon make amazing creatures, more amazing than reality, issue from a shell." In sum, Bachelard tells us that physical spaces become fantastic precisely because they are imbued with the imagination of those who inhabit them. He predated the games of today, but I think games are his philosophy taken to their logical conclusion. What is a game if not a space to imagine? And the genius of FromSoftware was creating a world with enough sparsity and symbolism to allow the player to fill the gaps, to project their own imagination. Just look at the amount of speculative lore. So what then? Is Miyazaki some sort of master symbologist? A Robert Langdon of the gaming world? Or is it that Japan hasn't been as enshittified as the West, and its creative minds are still given room to, create, and thus draw deep from the Akashic records or collective subconscious or whatever? Bachelard ends the Poetics of Space with a chapter on roundness. Quoting and then reshaping Jaspers, he writes, "Being is round." He meant it phenomenologically, that images of roundness express the intimacy and wholeness of being itself. But it's hard not to feel a wider resonance with Dark Souls. And I don't mean fat rolling. Its world folds back on itself, every path looping towards some forgotten origin, each endgame kindling a new one. Myth had the same shape, as does nature, and time before we carved it into timetables and deadlines and unholy shift work. From the moment we leave the nest, we begin to sense that we're in an age refusing its own ending. Humanity keeps the flame burning unnaturally, convinced that letting it die would turn them hollow. And we're left to question if the hollowing is simply what happens when a cycle can't complete its turn. And what about dark souls, you ask?